Yep. Francie's working. They're out of town, her and Paul. So, all right. Well, let's talk about this interesting little chapter and spend some time here. So, verse 1. Now, when he had finished speaking to Saul, the son of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. All right, so the word that's used in the Hebrew for this particular knitting of the soul, you have it here in your packet, is nephash. So you can see where it's used. It's 5315 in the Strong's. You can see what it means here. It means to be. Let me just read it. I was gonna. Let me read it to you. A breathing creature, an animal used widely in literal, figuratively senses, any appetite, beast, body, breath, creature, a desire, a greedy, in jeopardy, lust, man, me, mortally. If you read with me here in the Strong's definitions, you'll see all of this.
Yeah, where?
See, look in your packet, the next one. It has all the different reasons and things that it could be. How is that possible that Pack and Copy is not doing this?
Has different owners.
This is the very packet that Steve took up for me and ran off today. They forgot a page last week. They forgot several. So this is the copy of the Strong's definition that's in there. Let me just say it this way to make it a little bit easier. The Hebrew term nephash is often translated a living soul. It's the
We've got that one.
okay. So you have that first one here that's there. So it's also used in Genesis chapter 44 verse 30. I hope that they included that one in here for you.
Yes.
All right. That you can read Genesis chapter 44, verses 30 through 34. And it's in the very beginning of it. This is Jacob. See, it's right in here in your packet. This is talking about Jacob and his son Benjamin. And it says, now therefore, when I come to your servant my father, and the lad is not with us, here's the important part, since his life is bound up in the lad's life. And it talks about how if they don't have Benjamin, his father will go to his grave. It's the same word. It's the nephash. It's this knitting together, this overwhelming bonding. What is it Anne of Green Gables always called it? Bosom friends? Yeah, bosom friends. It's when Diana was her bosom friend. It's this knitting together of hearts that if you're lucky, you'll get with certain people in your life. Not necessarily talking about your husband or your children, but I mean some people, if you just get one of those in your lifetime that you knit your heart to somehow, you know what that feels like.
Like you.
And oh, you're sweet. And so it makes a big difference. Well, the reason why I'm trying to explain this to you is because this is what God did with Jonathan and David. He knit their hearts together in a way that in the natural should have never occurred. Who is Jonathan?
He's Saul's son.
He's the son of Saul. And so by all rights, what is he going to be in the future?
King.
The king. He should be, right? Even though that's not going to happen, he is the next in line to be the king. David, on the other hand, is the one who God has anointed to be that king. So what should, in the natural, they have been? Enemies, right? There should have been a jealousy there.
Did Jonathan know that?
Did Jonathan know that David was anointed? Well, the scripture isn't clear about where it is that at what point that he knows it. At some point he does.
He didn't last week.
We didn't last
but
week.
He didn't even realize that at that point David did when he was anointed.
He did not
It
realize
took him a while to realize. So when this all comes about, how God reveals it to him, although we're going to read here in a couple of verses something that makes it appear that Jonathan does know that David is going to be the anointed. Scripture doesn't say, and God came to Jonathan and told him, and he knit it together. But he's going to do some things that are gonna show us that there's some understanding there. The important part, though, on this first verse is that it's a supernatural event that occurred. I think it's a supernatural event when that one person in your life that you knit together with, it's sometimes unexplainable how it happens. And that's what God does. Why? Because God knew that it was going to be critically important for David and Jonathan to have this relationship as they move forward. Now, in the natural, again, it seems that that should have never happened. And so man reads this, and they say, their hearts were knit together. He loved David. We're going to read later on that, I'm just going to be spoiler alert, Jonathan is going to die later on, and David is going to say, my love for you, Jonathan, was greater than the love of women. Because of that knitting together, that heart pact that they had. And so what does man do with this? But they turn it into a homosexual relationship. And they say that Jonathan and David must have been lovers in the physical sense. Now, lest you think that's just something that has happened recently with all of this opening up of that, I went back and did some research on it and found back in 1290, back in the medieval times in 1290, there were some artistic renderings of David and Jonathan in compromising, places. And so this has been something that's been talked about for a very long time. If you Google it when you go home, you see all kinds of sculptures, and you see all kinds of paintings and different things that show that this love between these two men was something more than this supernatural thing that God had done. Yet we know that, what does God say about homosexuality? It's an abomination to him. We know that it's not that what he intended. However, a love for one another comes from God. And so instead of seeing it in the way that the world wants to see it, which is you can't love someone that much without having a sexual relationship, that's the way the world wants to see it, we need to be very clear that we look at this as this is a God thing, that he put these two men together in this knitting together. And so, homosexuality certainly has a different connotation throughout Scripture. It was much more tolerated back in the day. Even men who were married and had families, and boy, in the Roman culture, in the days of Jesus, it was very common that people who had healthy family relationships and a dozen kids and all of that also had a little something on the side with the original, one guy said, kind of made me laugh. He said the original boy toy on the side kind of thing that was going on. And so the mindset of people to this type of relationship has been very loose and open throughout the centuries, which would explain why maybe it's easy for people to go there. But we need to see this for what it is, this nefesh, this supernatural knitting together of these two. Even deeper than that. Even deeper than a brother relationship. It was when he says he loved him as his own soul, that means his love was greater than himself. And a lot of times brothers don't have that.
No, that's true.
And so,
but the Bible says laying down your life for a friend. I mean, it's the same kind of thing.
That's right. That's right. So this is a supernatural thing that he loved him as his own soul.
I think your reference in Genesis is a better way to look at it. The way a father is just, his soul is meant to his son.
Exactly. And nobody goes to that particular verse and tries to use that in any homosexual way or explanation with Jacob and his youngest son Benjamin. They explain that because he was the youngest of his beloved wife. And so that's how they explain that knitting together. And so it's just interesting. It's just interesting to see how the world will take something that God creates and turn it into something else.
Cheap counterfeit.
Yeah, exactly. All right, so verse 2, Saul took him that day and would not let him go home to his father's house anymore. So this doesn't mean that he can't go see his dad. That's not what he's talking about. He means that his residence was now going to be in the palace, that he was no longer going to go home and take up his job as shepherd. He was going to live full time there. Saul saw him as being that important. Again, 3 is just kind of another reiteration of verse 1. It says, and Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul. So what is a covenant in this time frame? We've talked a little bit about covenant in the past. It's a promise that's made that at this particular time in history was more binding than anything we can imagine. More binding than a contract where you sign your name, because if you choose to sign your name to a car loan and then you just don't make the payments, so you get sent to collection or whatever, there are all kinds of things that can happen. That's not how this was in those days. A covenant was something that would never be broken. To no matter what extreme you would go to, it would never be broken. And so Jonathan and David make that covenant. Verse 4, this is a sign, a symbol of that covenant. Jonathan took off the robe that was on him, and he gave it to David with his armor, even his sword, and his bow, and his belt, or in the original it says girdle. So this is the covenant gift that Jonathan is going to give to David to signify what he thinks about him. Now let's look at it a little bit deeper, what it is that he does. He took off his robe. Jonathan is the the prince, right? So he probably had something that was special, that was more than just the average shepherd boy would wear. Probably something a little more elaborate and ornate. And people would be used to seeing Jonathan dress that way. So when he takes off his outside robe and gives it to David, what is that signifying? What do you think that's signifying?
Is it like a transference?
It is. It's a type of transference of no longer do I want the outside world to see me as the crown prince, but I want you to wear this, which is where I get this idea of, at this time, Jonathan may have very well have known that David was next in line
And when you
for
were
this.
dispossessed, you were told you leave your robe at the doorway and you leave.
Yes.
Because that was an identifier.
An identifying
As a
mark
son.
of honor. When the prodigal son comes home, what does the father say? Bring out the robe and the fatted calf and all that. What does that mean? It's a signifying that he's now once again part of this family. It was a really important exterior sign of honor and prestige. And so Jonathan gives him that exterior robe. Even his armor, his sword. We've talked about in the past who had swords at this time.
The king.
The king and Saul. And as far as the scripture goes, that's all that we know, is just those two people in Israel had it. Because the Philistines knew how to forge iron, but they did not allow Israel to learn how to do that at this particular time. So Saul had a sword, and Jonathan had a sword. And Jonathan gives that precious sword to David.
Well, this is the type of Jesus and us, right? Jesus took off his robe that was on him and gave it to us with his armor, even the sword and the bow in his belt.
We could,
Sorry.
yeah. No, I'm not saying that that's. I'm not
Yeah,
saying that
this-
we can't look at it that way. Also, sure. Even his bow and his belt. Later on, chapter 21, we're going to find out that Jonathan's bow was extremely precious. It appears that he was even better with a bow than he was with a sword. And we know that he went up and did a lot of damage with a sword. But it says that his bow in chapter 21, how did it say it? Never failed to hit the mark. And so he was an excellent marksman, and I'm sure that he had a bow that was specially made for him of the finest materials. It was very precious to him. He gives him that, and then it talks about his belt or his girdle. And this would have been something specially made out of leather that he would have kept all of these precious items. So when you take that all as a package gift that he gives to him, what does that say?
He gave him protection,
He gave him protection.
and he gave it away from himself.
He took the very things that protected his life and limb,
And give it to him.
And
that
he
brought-
gave him the best of everything he had.
the best of everything that he had, and he handed it over to David as part of this covenant of the knitting together of their souls. Now, we are going to find out as we move along later on down the road that David leaves this sword. He doesn't take it with him. He is going to go back and look for Goliath's sword at a time later on when he's deciding that he needs a sword. And so he does leave that there. But I'm sure that it was a very precious item that he kept, that he treasured of Jonathan's, all of this that Jonathan gave to him.
I thought he took Goliath's sword with him.
He put it in his tent,
Yeah.
but it's going to end up somewhere else.
Oh.
It's going to get moved
When
around.
he kills all these Philistines, can't he also take some of their swords?
He could, but he goes and looks for the sword of Goliath
Yeah.
later.
I
So
think
he
probably
could.
get an
And
arsenal.
he could gain an arsenal by killing all of the Philistines and taking what they have. Absolutely, he
Giving
could do
them to
that.
his men and
Yeah,
running them.
no.
Yeah, he took their foreskins. You would think he
Yeah,
would take
yeah. He can have just about anything he wants at that point, right? Okay, so moving right along. So David went out and wherever Saul sent him, and he behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all of the people, and also in the sight of Saul's servants. All right, this is where we're going to see some jealousy begin to really brew in Saul. Wherever Saul sends David, he apparently puts him into positions of authority over the army. Wherever he sends him, David does well. He goes out and he is able to accomplish every goal to the point where his reputation is now growing, and everyone thinks well of him. He was accepted in the sight of the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Why would that be important? Well, because we're not really very sure that Saul's servants thought a lot of Saul.
Then, yeah. They had lost a lot of respect.
Absolutely. And his behavior is going to create even further burdens down the road as they begin to see him totally come unhinged. And so the very people that are around Saul continually are now beginning to look to David as the one who is to receive their honor and the glory of all of that as they begin to push Saul away. Now, the interesting part of that is, for me anyway, is that David does gain all of that glory, but ultimately, who's creating this?
God.
God,
He's
right?
orchestrating that.
God is the one that knits Jonathan together with David. God is the one that provides this covenant. God is the one that creates success for David. Why? Because God is with David. The Spirit of God is with David, and he puts him into these positions where he is continually successful. Verse 6. Oh, sorry.
I'm sorry, I'm just, the thought came across that, and because David was God's choice. Saul
Right.
was the people's choice.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
That made a big difference.
Absolutely. All right, verse 6. Now it had happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out of all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul, with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s.
Leave it to women to cook.
Oh boy, stirring up a little bit of trouble, right? And so we don't know for sure. This is talking about David returning from the slaughter of the Philistine. It uses it in the singular in this translation. The two ways that if you look at the different translation is perhaps this is coming back from slaying Goliath, very likely, or perhaps it's one of the raids that's being talked about where he goes out and has great success and kills the Philistines. It doesn't matter so much except for that he's coming back from a successful military operation, and when he does that, the women are coming out and they're singing and dancing supposedly for King Saul, because that's what you do.
He's slain 10,000 if it's only Goliath.
Well, but he's coming back. Exactly. That's a good point too. That's a very good point. That so perhaps the use of the Philistine, it should be Philistines at that point. So the women sang as they danced and said, "See, Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s." Is it good to slay your thousands? I mean, is that created? That's a measure of success, right? But then right after that, if they're going to compare him to David, Saul's down here. Once again, David's up here, right? Saul's not going to look favorably upon that. So what does that tell us about Saul that we already see a huge difference from? There was a time earlier on where we saw some humility in Saul. We saw him behave in some ways that were, some good ways. Those are being pushed away. But remember what happened. The Spirit of the Lord left Saul. And we're going to see him just progressively become more and more ungodly and unrighteous in his behavior because the Spirit of God has left him. So verse 8, then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him, and he said, "They have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom?" So of course, David's going to want to come and overthrow me and take my kingdom because now everyone is just puffing him up and making him look very important. We know that this particular little song was very well known because, again, later on down the road in a few chapters from now, we're going to find out that the Philistines had heard about this song because they're going to say, well, didn't the women say that David had killed his thousands, although King Saul had only, or his tens of thousands, although Saul had only killed. So it's an important enough song that it permeated out and preceded David wherever it is that he went. So everyone knew about this. So in verse 9 it says, so Saul eyed David from that day forward. And what they're talking about there is that jealousy. The eye was a symbol of jealousy. It was a suspicion. Everywhere he went, he watched him. He no longer trusted David. He no longer thought that David had his best interest.
Evil eye.
The evil eye, that's right.
But he didn't send David away. He kept him very close.
He does for a while,
Keep his
but
eye on him.
at first, but then let's look and see where jealousy and anger and craziness will take you and see what he does there. So it happened, I'm in verse 10, it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. Okay, so that distressing spirit from God, that throws a lot of people because they don't understand how God could send a distressing spirit. Wouldn't that come from the enemy?
It's even better in the NIV, an evil spirit.
An evil
It really
spirit.
did throw
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so we talked about that a little bit earlier on, and we discussed the fact that God has complete and utter control over everything in every spirit world. We know from our other scriptures that we've discussed several times that the angels that fell, the fallen angels, God took and placed them in certain positions. There are some that are bound at the Euphrates River that are going to be released at the end time scenario. Revelation tells us that story. God certainly has complete and utter control over every demonic spirit. Again, it's that permissive will and directive will. Does God direct the spirits, or does God allow the spirits to do the work that he wants them to do? So this can come from God for the purpose that he has in mind. And the Spirit of God is no longer a covering over him. So these distressing spirits that come, Saul no longer has any willpower or desire to do what God would have him do. And so God is using that in a permissive way. And so when it says he prophesied inside the house, that's again another confusing thing. How do you prophesy with a distressing or evil spirit? Well, it's evil prophecy, right? Please don't tell me that you don't know that that goes on even today. There are people who are false prophets, who are prophesying evil. Where does that come from? It doesn't come, well, it doesn't come from God. He was very clear to the prophets. He said, if I give a prophecy and one of my prophets tell you it's from me and it doesn't come true, what? Kill him. Because he's a false prophet. And so God was very clear that his prophecy would always come true. But this distressing spirit created an atmosphere where Saul could prophesy in a demonic way. What did he say?
I'm going to kill David.
He certainly was thinking that, wasn't
That's
he?
what he said.
Yeah. And so we don't know exactly what that all included, but it certainly wasn't something that God wanted from him. And so David comes in. Remember, the background is that David would, when Saul would go into these rages, these fits, David would come in and play the instrument, and what would that do? Calm him. Somehow that was able to soothe Saul. And so David continues to do that. So while he's also an important military man, it appears that he is still waiting on Saul with this musical ministry that he has to soothe him. So David played the instrument as he had at other times, but there was a spear in Saul's hand. That's never good. And Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. All right. So when it says, I will pin him to the wall, do you think he meant, I'll just get a shirt here and boy, I'll show him. I'll show him. Exactly, right? He'd like for that sword to go right through him and stick him to the wall. That's pretty extreme for someone who is soothing him with musical instrument. But what is amazing to me in this verse is it says, and David escaped him twice.
Yeah.
So that means the first time he threw and David ran, what did David do?
He went back.
He came back. He came back with the knowledge that God wanted him in this ministry, that God wanted him to be this person who assisted Saul. And so he came back after an attempt. I think to myself, would I do that?
No.
Sometimes I don't even go back when people just talk to me mean, much less throw a spear at me. I don't want to go back and get in that again. He goes back for a second dose. Now, we're going to go through a lot of different things here as we go through it. I wanted to share something and be thinking about it as we go through the rest of this chapter, because it was a new teaching for me when the first time I heard it. And that is this idea that we, as human beings, are immortal until God's timing and purpose is through. In other words, you cannot be killed until God wills it. We don't often think about that because our human mind goes in a different direction. So we think about, when the first time that was taught to me, I was thinking about, and I was thinking, what about those people like 9/11 that were on that airplane, and they took that guy down, and all those people were killed there, and car accidents where a young mother gets killed and there's 3. Is that God's will? And how does that happen, and how does that protection removed from him? But we forget that God sees everything as this tapestry woven together. Is it a good thing that those people were killed, and some of them very young? Is it a good thing that the mother gets killed and her children are left? No, it's not that it's a good thing, but God can use that to further other things, to strengthen other people, to put other people in their lives, to build a legacy for people that needs to be thought about and viewed about. So the horrible things, the hurts that happen to us when someone is taken from us early on in life is a very human way, and we look at that and we go, why, God, why? And people get angry, and they don't understand why it would be done, because we don't think about death the way God thinks about death. We think about death as an ending. God thinks about it as a beginning. It's the ending of pain and sorrow and the beginning of joy. Because that's where real life begins. But we don't think about it that way. And so if we stop and think about the fact that we are immortal until God's will and purpose for us is finished, and we know that that is true because it says in another scripture that our days are numbered from before we're ever even born. Our days are numbered. God knows exactly how many days each one of us are going to have. So when my mother says, "Oh, you make me so nervous when you go to Israel," and I go,
Or when you drive.
and I say, I'm not going to die in Israel unless it's my time. And if I were in Sonora, it would still be my time. And if it would be a different way. Not if it's my time.
Right.
Because God knows the exact moment I'm going to die. And he chooses that exact moment for a purpose that maybe my mother and my son and my husband wouldn't understand, but God knows, and he's going to use that to build together that tapestry. And so when I first heard that, not only did it change the way I think about these horrible events that happen where it seems that people are taken from us, but it also really made me feel secure in knowing that I am held in the palm of God's hand. I am safe in the palm of God's hand until he says, okay, I'm going to let you loose now because you're going to come be with me.
And we tend to look at it, well, they were needed here, but maybe they're needed more up there. Maybe, he has uses for us there.
Whatever the reasoning is, we can't even begin to fathom whatever that reasoning is, but the plan and the purpose that we're here for was finished. Some people it's finished when they're 7. Some people when they're 20. Some people when they're 40, 70, 95, 106.
I saw an illustration on that where there's this line of people, just a single line of humanity, where they're dying and line up, that you can't cut in, you can't leave the line,
No.
you can't go to the back.
No.
What your time is, that's when you...
So do you find, is it just me, or do you find that really comforting?
I find it very comforting.
I find it very comforting to know that I am safe and protected, and that as long as I'm in doing the will and the purpose of God, that he knows exactly when is the appropriate time, and it's not going to be one day sooner, and it's not going to be one day later.
Well, there is a scripture that he numbers our
Yeah.
days.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I discovered that when my father was
Yeah.
passing away, and I was frantically.
Looking for comfort. Yeah. Yeah.
Mrs. Peters, the wife of, I can't remember her first name, but she was
Alva?
cured of,
Alva.
she was cured of cancer, but she still died on the day she would have died of cancer.
Isn't that
Yeah,
amazing?
it was just still that same amount of time was what she was given. But she lived it healthy.
Yeah, it is really amazing. I was watching this show on television, and it was about this guy who at 17, he got, at 15 he got a brain tumor, and they had to go through this horrible treatment, but he actually survives from this fungus that got into his brain, and it was a very weird thing that nobody should live from, but he lived. And so he lived for 2 years, and then he gets in a car accident, and he had what's called an internal decapitation. So did you see it on TV? So the inside of his neck detaches, his head detaches from his spine, and he lives through that against all odds.
Wow.
He lives through that. And then there was a couple of other different little things that weren't quite that dramatic, but that had happened to him. And he was alive and on the show and there. And they had strong faith, and God was using his testimony for things. And I'm thinking to myself, you cannot kill that man. You cannot kill that man until God decides that his testimony is done. That his purpose and plan for being here is done. An internal decapitation? Really? And you can, and he's going to survive from that?
Decapitation.
That's right.
It was complete. Every
So that's just pretty amazing to me. Yeah. So we're going to see David go through a lot of different things, but remember, God has a plan and a purpose for David. He's going to use him, and he had that plan and a purpose for David way back.
Yeah.
Way back when he told the children of Israel in Deuteronomy, he said, "Now you're going to have a king someday, and here's the way that it's going to be, and here's what's going to happen."
Yes, well, way back from the very beginning.
Way
because
back.
The Messiah is going to come through him.
That's
so
exactly right. Exactly right.
It was the plan all along.
Yeah.
from the-
That's exactly right. It was always that plan, and all these little threads that we read in the stories of Rahab and Ruth and all of that all feed right into this whole thing. And if you tie it all together, you know, it's a tapestry always looks a little like this from the outside, but then when you turn it over and you see the beauty of the rug, that's kind of how the story all plays out. So let's think about that as we go through some of this with David. So he escaped his presence twice. Now, verse 12. Saul was afraid of David because the Lord was with him, but it had departed from Saul. So Saul knows both of those things. Therefore Saul removed him from his presence. Here's where he's going to kick him out, because now he doesn't even want to be around him. And made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. That's a military term. It means he went out to do battle and came back to do battle. And you'll see that used often in Samuel. He went out and came in before the people. And David behaved wisely in all of his ways, and the Lord was with him. Therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. Again, tells us a lot about Saul, right? But all of Israel and Judah loved David because he went out and came in before them. So they love him. Why? He's a protector, defender. He's the guy. He killed Goliath. He took care of the Philistines. He's going out and coming in, and he's got all this success, killing his tens of thousands. He's the guy. He's the man. And so they love him because of that. And evidently, they didn't have that same respect for Saul. So then Saul says to David, "Here is my older daughter," and in the Hebrew it's pronounced Merav. "I will give her to you as a wife. Only be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles." For Saul thought, "Let my hand not be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines be against him." Okay, there's a lot there. First of all, what was David supposed to get when he killed Goliath?
The daughter.
Did that ever happen up to now?
No.
So that promise never came through on that, did it? But here now he's saying, okay, now I am going to give you my daughter, but you know what? You're going to need to be valiant for me and fight the Lord's battles. Well, what had David been doing? Being valiant and fighting the Lord's battles. And how ironic do you find it that Saul says, fight the Lord's battles? How ironic is that? He knows in his head that these battles are the Lord's. He knows that the Spirit of the Lord is gone from him and it's on David. And I find that pretty nervy. That he says, and you're going to go out and fight the Lord's battles for me, David. Because he says, now, maybe I shouldn't kill him. I've tried a couple times. That didn't work. Let not my hand be against him, but let the hand of the Philistines. Because eventually, he's going to go out into battle, and they're going to get him. So he's really doing what? He's setting David up to fall in battle. Verse 18, so David says to Saul, "Who am I, and what is my life or my father's family in Israel, that I should be the son-in-law to the king?" Well, when he fought Goliath, he should have been the son-in-law to the king. That should have been coming to him. But in a very humble manner, David is saying, wow, who am I that I would get...
I'm a shepherd boy.
I'm a shepherd boy. The king's daughter would be mine. My father's family, we're a very humble people. There's nothing important about us. How would we get that? Also, when you... are given someone of importance, there's going to be the matter of a dowry that's going to need to be discussed. And so we can imagine, we don't know what it is, but we can imagine that a king's daughter is going to be pretty costly. And so a little shepherd boy that's going to be a lot for him. And so verse 19 tells us, but it happened at the time when Merab, Saul's daughter, should have been given to David, that she was given to Adriel, the Maholathite, as a wife. So what does Saul do? Reneges. Goes back on, he breaks the commitment that he gives to David. That had to be both embarrassing and humbling for David to have to experience that. Verse 20, now Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. Why would that please him, considering how he feels about about David?
It was something he could take away.
It's a tool, right? It's a weapon that could be used against him. So Saul says, I will give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. Oh boy, I can just take care of it all, right? I can do all of this. Therefore Saul said to David a second time, you shall be my son-in-law today. So this is the second time that he's done that. That doesn't mean this is the second time he's the son-in-law, because the first one got given to someone else. And we're going to find out later on in the road that he's going to play tricks with Michal too.
Well, maybe she's kind of makes you wonder if she wasn't, maybe she's not too fond, her dad's not too fond of her. Maybe she's rebellious.
Oh, well, a daughter for the king was something to be used.
Yeah.
It was, oftentimes people gave their daughters to build, treaties and to make peace, and, it was something you could give that was of some value to give that.
Because he said she was a snare.
Well, so that she may be a snare to David. So he's wanting to use her as a snare. And we're going to find out that that Michal is going to play some important roles in some of that. But keep in mind that she loved David. So he's using that love that his own daughter has for David as a weapon here, which again doesn't speak very well of Saul. So Saul commanded his servants, communicate with David secretly and say this, look, the king has delight in you, and all of his servants love you. Now therefore, become the king's son-in-law. Well, the first time around, David had said, who am I? That I don't have anything to give to become this. So now he's saying, go to him and sort of start speaking in his ear and saying, oh, the king loves you, and he's going to, all the servants love you. You should become his son-in-law. That's going to be a really great thing. So he's working that way. So Saul's servant spoke these words in the hearing of David. And David said, does it seem to you a light thing to be the king's son-in-law, seeing that I am a poor and lightly esteemed man? Once again, I have to believe that dowry issue is raising up in David's mind, because again, this is a king's daughter. They're costly. It's going to take a lot, and David nor his family have that type of wealth. Also, he's being very humble about himself. And the servants of Saul told him, saying, in this manner, David spoke. So they're reporting back to Saul what David is saying. And Saul said, thus you shall say to David, go and tell him this, the king does not desire any dowry, but 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to take vengeance of the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So they were to go back now and say, oh, don't worry about the money, just because you're poor, and, don't worry about that, because really the king doesn't want anything. Oh, well, maybe 100 foreskins of the Philistines, but to make it appear as though David was just doing a light thing. But the true motive was that Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. Let's talk about this weird thing for a little bit. So 100 foreskins of the Philistines. Why would you think that would even be something that Saul would conjure up?
They wouldn't want to give him up.
They wouldn't want to give him up willingly.
Yeah, are they dead or alive?
The what?
Other neighbors were all circumcised because they were relatives way back when.
Okay.
The Philistines were the only group that weren't
So are you saying you're thinking David's circumcising them?
No,
Oh,
I'm thinking
okay.
that proves you killed the Philistine and not an Amorite or Canaanite or, you know, you can't just go to any easy prey and kill them. You
Okay.
have to go to a Philistine.
Okay. And if you're going to take a foreskin, are you going to have to kill the man? Yeah, you can't just knock him out, really, you know? They're going to fight for that. And so Saul knows that by taking that little memento, that he's going to literally have killed 100 Philistines. And they're going to fight like they've never fought before once they see what's being done. And so through that battle, what is Saul envisioning is going to happen to David?
David's going to be killed.
David's
And he
going
doesn't have to do it.
and he doesn't have to do it. So once again, he's setting David up for this death. But just as we spoke of earlier, is it David's time? No. And so obviously God is with him on this, and let's look and see how David takes that and turns it around. And it says, "Now when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired, so that whatever time limit David had given him. Therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed not 100, but 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. Then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as a wife." So David says, well, if I'm going to show Saul that I believe that his daughter is valuable and worthy, so much so that I'm going to give him double what he's asking for, which shows that David is taking this very seriously. So he goes out and does and kills 200 Philistines, brings the foreskins, it says, and gave them to the king in full count. I have to, in my head, I'm always envisioning the story. Is he like 1, 2, 3, 4, counting them out? How is that looking? I'm not sure. Sometimes it's a good thing we don't have pictures. Just,
There actually is a bas relief of another group using this.
Oh my goodness. Well, and our imaginations are good. We can kind of imagine
It was bad.
what it was, but it was bad for the Philistines for sure. Yeah, absolutely. So now Saul has absolutely no excuse. He can't go back on this one, and he gives Michal to David. 28. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David. Well, he's seen that how many times before? We've seen it over and over. He knows. And that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. So in other words, he's thinking, well, now I don't even know if she's going to be any good to me. Because she loves him, I don't know that I can use her. And Saul was still even more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. So Saul becomes David's enemy continually, but it's interesting, isn't it, that it doesn't say anything about David becoming Saul's enemy continually. So this is a very one-sided fight that's going on. David is simply, as we go forward from this, he is simply trying to keep Saul at bay. He's not going after Saul. Saul continually is going after him. And the princes of the Philistines went out to war. And so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name was highly esteemed. And so this is just kind of a summary of David's successes. We're going to read about them in detail as we go through the next few chapters, but this is going to be just a summary of all of those. David was continually successful in all that he did. All right. You can go ahead and turn it off if you want. That's the ending of that. I did want to also just mention to you that